when you have low interest rates and lots of leverage, that is a subsidy to the debtor. It is a subsidy that is passed from the creditor, from the saver, to the debtor.
Yep.
And this is what you facilitated during that process. Now, I think people should have, reasonable leverage to invest are good things because it increases productivity. But the reward then for the saver who's providing that funds should not be forgotten. And when we force down through our policy interest rates that favors one over the other, you're making choices for other people. And I think that's unfortunate. It's not the market. It's not an economic system working anymore. And people blame it on capitalism. It wasn't capitalism. It was a very different form of socialism that we were practicing at the time.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm its founder and your host, Adam Taggart. Last week, in his much anticipated speech at Jackson Hole, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell announced that, quote, "The time has come for policy to adjust," which is why world markets now have a 100% probability expectation that the federal funds rate will be cut at the upcoming September meeting. And in the words of Nick Timiraos, chief economist for the Wall Street Journal and suspected media mouthpiece for the Fed, quote, "The Powell pivot is complete." So, is that indeed the case? And if so, what should we expect from here from the speed and depth of rate cuts? What will the expected impacts be on the economy? And which ones will be felt soon and which perhaps not for quarters from now? And lastly, is this the correct policy move the Fed should be pursuing? For a true experts-informed perspective on these very important questions, we've got the great privilege today of speaking with Dr. Thomas Hoenig, former CEO of the Kansas City Fed, former voting member of the Federal Open Markets Committee, a former director of the FDIC, and now a distinguished senior fellow at the Mercatus Center. Dr. Hoenig, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and good to be with you again.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to have you here. Couldn't be more timely, given Powell's announcement at Jackson Hole last week. And actually, you yourself were at Jackson Hole, correct?
I was. I attended the conference and enjoyed it very much.
All right. Well, look, I've got a lot of questions here for you, but maybe I can just start with, what was it like at Jackson Hole? What were your key takeaways from there?
Well, the topic was really on the transmission mechanism for monetary policy, broadly speaking. And there were some really interesting papers on that topic. And I was impressed by the fact that two of the main papers tied monetary policy and its challenges to fiscal policy as well. So they're making progress, I think, in the connection between fiscal and monetary policy in the academic world again, and perhaps in the policy world in time. So that's number one. Number two, Chairman Powell did speak, opened the conference with his remarks, and he did pretty much give a history of their policy really since COVID began. And he acknowledged that in raising rates in 2022, they were behind the curve. However, he was quick to also point out everyone else was as well. That somehow, I understand that, but I think, not sure how that fits in. I think more importantly, though, he did message that he felt that inflation was well within the trend line of coming back down to the target of 2%, that they would achieve that goal, would be my takeaway. And therefore, he did leave a pretty clear signal that they would be cutting rates, which of course switches the conversation to how much they will cut it, and that's less clear, and whether there will be more cuts after it, and that's also less clear. So we know we're pretty confident, unless there's a huge surprise between now and September, the middle of September, we have a pretty clear message that they're going to cut rates So that's
Okay.
the main takeaway from Dr. Powell. I should say for Chairman Powell, and then for the papers themselves, I think the major transition to taking fiscal policy into consideration is a big move forward.
Okay, great. And I definitely want to ask you about fiscal policy as well. I guess before we move on, I'm going to ask because I think a lot of the audience probably has the same question. Like, what goes on there at Jackson Hole? Is everybody just sitting around waiting for Powell to speak, or are there a whole bunch of other speakers? I mean, you mentioned they were sort of talking about the transmission mechanism, but what is the actual event like there?
Well, it's a relatively small group, maybe 100 people. Number one, both central bankers from all over the world. I mean, the Central Bank of Ukraine was there, for example. South America is well represented, Asia, Europe for sure. So it's a broad base of policymakers from around the world and a broad base of academics and former policymakers from around the world. I mean, universities from all over the world join in. So it's a very for all that, it's a relatively informal conference, and in the sense that the papers are well prepared in advance. They are distributed in advance to all the participants, the 100 participants, to read and to prepare for. So that's, I think, a very important consideration. Now, the meetings themselves they go from 8 in the morning till about noon or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, depending on which day. It's held Friday and Saturday. And the paper is presented on the topic of, for example, the tie between monetary policy and fiscal, or how does monetary policy get transmitted through the economy to either stimulate or slow the economy. And you have a paper, and then you have 1 or 2 discussants. And they kind of bring up various issues around the paper, various comments about the paper. And then the floor is open for questions. So the presenter of the paper and the commenters on the paper are in front of the audience, and the audience can ask any question it chooses. There's no prescribed method, and they do. You usually have a good 20 to 25 minutes of nothing but questions, and you get a lot of takeaway. And there's even kind of dialogue within the conference participants themselves in the way they comment and on the way they ask questions. So you get a lot of discussion there. And then I think it's very important that most of the afternoons are open. It is it's in a national park. That's where it's held. And in the afternoon, there's time for hiking, for example, but you hike as a group and you have conversations about the morning's meetings. Mm-hmm. So you carry the conversation forward between policymaker and academic, among policymakers, among academics for that afternoon. And then in the evening, you have a dinner and you continue the conversation further. So you have, I think, a really wide open but informal networking opportunity, communications opportunity among people from all over the world to talk about important policy issues. So I think it's a very valuable conference for the policymakers that are not just U.S., but global.
Okay, and that's sort of where I was going here, where it sounds like it's sort of an exchange of best practices, right? They're up there presenting these well-researched papers, but then they kind of get to let their hair down and have informal conversations, which maybe you can make a lot more progress sometimes than if you have to deal with all the bureaucracy of official politics.
Right, and I would also note it's open. There are media who are in attendance through the entire conference, and therefore it isn't. It's not a secret meeting. People have confidence that it's being reported well, I hope, to the world.
Okay, and I actually saw you being interviewed by Bloomberg and I think a few other media outlets there too. So, all right. Well, look. The world now is basically expecting the Fed to cut this coming month here, right? And interestingly, you mentioned that Powell admitted that the Fed was behind the curve in 2022, right? I'm curious if he sort of explained why the Fed was behind the curve, but where I'm going with this question is, had a lot of folks on this channel recently, some well-known economists like Anna Wong from Bloomberg, or Claudia Sahm of the Sahm role, as well as just macro analysts. And there's this increasing, I think, agreement that the economic data is harder to trust right now than it's been in a long time. And I think it's because, you know, there's a lot of dust in the air, or, you know, whatever the reasons may be. And obviously COVID did sort of scramble the data set for a good while. And I'm wondering if that's part of Powell's explanation for maybe why the Fed was behind the curve, which was, hey, we didn't have great data. We were doing the best we could with the data we had. And if that's the case, what's different about now? I mean, is there a chance that we're still making decisions based upon imperfect data? And I know data is never perfect, but maybe data that's more imperfect than normal still.
Well, that's a very good question. I don't have a solid answer for you. I would say that, first of all, to your point, and why they were behind the curve, he did go through the history somewhat, but I think the principal explanation I've been given myself relative to that is that the uncertainty was high. We wanted to be cautious. Things were going on elsewhere, and that was the explanation given. Whether you buy that explanation is up to the individual. But because the fact is they were behind the curve, and you can't change that. So I think that's important. Now, as to the data today, you're right. Data is always imperfect, and I don't know that that's going to necessarily get a whole lot better anytime soon. But I think the fact of the matter is there is sufficient data, and I think we fail to recognize the importance of systematic anecdotal data. That is, the surveys that are conducted within each of those 12 reserve banks, the interaction they have with the business community, the consumer. So you have a sense of whether the data is really kind of on track, or if you have a uneasy feeling about it, and you make decisions accordingly. And I think that's always been the case as well. Now we have a little less reliable. I know there was a major adjustment to the employment numbers. That was the big reason for this discussion. They've been large in the past. They'll be large again in the future, because surveys are surveys, and you can get a bias in a survey pretty easily. But the main thing is, when you look at the data, as imperfect as it is, you know that the economy has been growing steadily and reasonably well. You know it from the data, you know it from anecdotal, and you know it from your own experiences within your community. Now, as far as the inflation numbers coming down, certainly they have the rate of increase in prices has slowed. But I remind people, as recently as the last measure on the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, that it was still 3%. And as pointed out to me by others, and as I pointed out, that's still 50% above target.
Yep.
And we shouldn't lose sight of that. So I think, prudence, care is of importance. I think Powell knows that. I think the Open Market Committee knows that. But they're anxious to not get behind the curve on the other side now, and lower too late and cause a recession. And that's on their mind. And they're looking at that, and that's, I think, driving this decision to an important degree.
Okay. I guess the question I'm going to ask you, I'll give you a little context first, but the question I'm going to ask you is what's your opinion of the current Fed policy? Is it the appropriate policy for the moment? Or is the Fed behind the curve and should have been cutting earlier? Or do you think the Fed, maybe should be higher for longer and making sure that the inflation dragon is is good and truly slain here. I will say, there's definitely an argument that people have been making, I think, increasingly, which is, hey, the job market is continuing to cool. And, as you and I have talked about in the past, Fed policy acts with a lag effect, right?
Yeah.
And before we got the pretty dramatic write-down in payroll numbers at the last Jerome Powell press conference, right after the latest FOMC guidance, I thought the media was kind of uncharacteristically pushing back on Chairman Powell about, are you sure that the employment market's really okay? And several times he had to come out and say, it is normalizing, but I'm not seeing anything that's got me worried about the labor market in any major way yet. And then, of course, we had the pretty dramatic write-down in the payrolls, which I think have just inflamed people's concerns that, whoa, wait a minute, maybe this labor market's cooling a lot faster than the Fed expected here, and now the Fed's going to be behind the curve, which historically, when you look back at past recessions, if you look at the unemployment rate, it tends to spike, and then the Fed, who had hiked rates and was sort of hanging out, all of a sudden gets in this panic mode of rapid cutting, trying to kind of catch up to the recession that's arriving. Who knows if that's going to happen this time or not? But people, I think, have that understandable concern. So, based upon your understanding, and I get that you don't have all the data you used to have when you sat on the FOMC. What's your opinion of current Fed policy here?
Well, I'm going to back up on you a little bit. I think one of the major issues that the Fed has created for itself is this forward guidance. And there's a lot of economic theory that forward guidance can actually do the job for you, but I don't really buy into that strongly. What I would tell you is one of the things the Fed did last winter, I'll call it late fall, was it began signaling that cuts were in the offing. And what that does is it gives the market, not the consumer, but the market itself, a pretty strong signal that you can speculate long.
Mm-hmm.
And that's—
Sorry to interrupt, but which the market then did do in both Q1 and Q2, yeah.
Did, and is doing now. So you want to be careful with those forward guidance numbers, but that is the practice they've instituted and they use. Now, it did, as you say, the market eased on its own, which is the forward guidance effect. You've got more speculation in the market, and the market actually got ahead of the Fed, and we really saw inflation begin to reignite. So that's the danger of forward guidance when it's pretty iffy with the data that you might be using.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here we are again, and I think the Fed will cut. It's made clear it will, but the key for them right now is when they cut, and I'll talk about whether they should or not in a moment, but when they cut, the messaging is absolutely critical. Because if they say we're going to cut and they give any hint that more is on the table, the markets will react. We will have a good stock market day, at least for that day, and the market will move forward based on that. What they have to say is, we will only move forward, I think, in my opinion, we will only move forward as inflation does in fact come down on a year-on-year basis. Mm-hmm. That's the first thing I would say. And I would carry that message strongly at that meeting, because the market's going to, when you watch the press conference after that meeting, I bet I get, for every 3 questions, 2 questions will be about, where are you going to move again? How might you move again? What's the outlook for you moving again? And that will be the message that he'll have to control. So that's, I think, very important to keep in mind. Whether they should have cut, that's another matter. As I said, inflation, they use what's called the personal consumption expenditure inflation index, and that's 2.5%, which makes it closer to 2. But I say don't leave out this consumer price index, which is closer to 3, and which most indexes are tied to, and therefore has a very important role in the economy. And I think that's still probably too high. On the employment side, I would tell you 4.3% unemployment is a very good number. And yes, if you get a shock, that may spike up. But the other point of it is that in that market, that means if the economy takes off from a rate cut or expected series of rate cuts, those numbers will stay lower and inflation might reignite. And the most important thing, one of the most important things for long-term full employment or maximum employment is price stability. So they've kind of changed their focus to the employment market, less on the inflation market, but inflation drives most things in the future, including employment. If inflation takes off again and they have to raise rates, that will be very destabilizing. So I hope that they're very careful in their announcement if and when they cut, and do not give the impression of a series of cuts, or I think they will have inflation back on the board. And remember, finally, there's still a lot of liquidity in that market. You can see that in the fact that the stock market has moved up very rapidly.
Yeah.
You can see it in the Fed's balance sheet, which is still well over 7 trillion in size. And it's a very, there's still a lot of gunpowder in the market as far as demand and full employment, as demand and inflation looks forward. So they have a lot, they're in a tight position. I don't deny that. But I would not switch my emphasis away from price stability, or at least 2% target over employment at this point.
Okay. What I hear you saying is priority number one should be making sure the inflation dragon is dead and buried, and then then turn to the employment market if you have to at that point. But everything is better served by having that inflation dragon slain. Okay, so to your point about there still being a lot of liquidity in the market, one other really important element that wasn't on the list you just mentioned, but you gave a nod to it earlier, is fiscal policy.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, again, that was a topic of discussion at Jackson Hole, and I think it's been a really interesting time policy-wise, because the Fed, who had been very willing, I think, to ease and intervene post GFC for the decade that followed, has now been pumping the brakes for the past 2 years. But it seems like the easing baton just got passed to the fiscal side of things, and they've had their foot jammed on the accelerator. And I can't remember the exact deficit number right now, but it's 2-something trillion, I believe, for this year, right?
Yeah.
So you could basically say monetary and fiscal policy have been at odds to a certain extent. I'd love to kind of dig into your thoughts on both that dynamic in the here and now, but maybe we should start at a higher level, because it sounds like this is what was discussed at Jackson Hole. What do you think should be the appropriate relationship between monetary and fiscal policy? Should they be independent of each other? Should they be closely coordinated? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think each has to be aware of the other. That's how I would put it, but independent of one another. So that's where I start. Aware, but independent. And I think that's particularly important for the Federal Reserve, because it prints the money, and it has to remain independent of fiscal policy, or it will be subservient, and we will have really bad outcomes. And let me explain. We say that the Fed and the fiscal policy have been kind of at opposite right now, because fiscal has been expanding and monetary policy has been kind of on hold relative to printing money. And that's correct. But remember, that's because the Federal Reserve has started with an enormous amount of excess liquidity that they had put into the market. Mm-hmm. There's so much so that while the government was borrowing money, the Fed still had enormous numbers of excess reserves on its balance sheet. And so much so that it was using what's called a reverse repo. And all that is they put it in with one hand and they take it out with the other to keep interest rates from dropping below their target. So you've had that. And it started out, to just give you one dimension of that, it started out about this so-called reverse repo, or the left hand pulling money out. There was $2.5 trillion that they were pulling out of the market to keep interest rates pegged. That's now less than $0.5 trillion. It's less than 500 billion. So that's been redirected from the Fed into the purchase of new securities, for example, whether new Treasury securities as they've been offered in auction. Well, once that excess goes, then once that excess on the Fed's balance sheet goes, and the government's still issuing new debt of $2 trillion a year, then who's going to buy that debt becomes a more immediate issue for the Fed. Because right now the private sector can buy that debt because there's all this excess liquidity, or foreign interests can buy that debt. But going forward, we know that foreign interests are a little bit less interested in buying debt. They have plenty of it. And the private sector, the excess is running out. So to get them to lend to the government, interest rates are going to have to rise. And if they rise, then that becomes a contraction on the economy, perhaps, probably. That means who's going to lend without having interest rates rise? And that's the Fed. So the government will be turning to the Federal Reserve, saying, basically, buy my debt so that interest rates don't rise, or it'll be your fault, Fed, for interest rates rising. And the Fed has to say, wait a minute, to Congress. And they should be saying this now. They should be saying this right now, at least behind closed doors in conversations. You have a huge new debt issuances coming forward. We know it. We know this year it's 2 trillion. We know next year it's going to be close to 2 trillion. You've got to get your house in order. If we try and buy all that debt, we have to print the money to do it. We're going to reignite inflation and create real havoc. So that message has to come out now. There hasn't been much said about it anywhere. It's been kind of ignored. But we're getting closer to the time when that has to be looked at far more carefully. And if they don't do that, then I think we're inviting future problems in 2026, 2027, whenever it might show itself.
Okay. What is your level of confidence that your preferred outcome there will happen versus Congress just doesn't listen and we end up having we reignite inflation in those future years?
Well, at the moment, this is an election year. It's hard to read how things will be after the election. But at the moment, confidence is low. There's been very little discussion. I think importantly, around my concern is there's been very little, if any, real discussions in the political campaigns, whether they're for the congressional seats or Senate seats or the presidency, over our mounting fiscal challenge, our mounting fiscal debt that's coming forward. And because there's not been much discussion, I think it is therefore more vulnerable to being ignored until there is a more serious set of consequences. And that worries me.
Okay, let me ask that question a different way. Looking at it from the cheap seats, I don't see a lot of accountability for politicians who influence the fiscal side. I don't see much of a governor for them to control their behavior, except for the voting booth, right? If inflation, if bad policy leads to whatever conditions that make the average Joe, injured and angry enough to vote them out of office, that seems to be the only governor, which maybe works in the long run, but it lets a sitting politician basically do whatever they want up until that time. And for a lot of them, it's kind of like, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll be out of office when the chickens come home to roost anyways. So it'll be somebody else's problem. So am I am I correct, or am I too jaded? Are there other, does the Fed have a way to kind of really wrestle Congress's attention? Or are there other elements in there to hold the fiscal side to account beyond just the voting booth?
Well, you can't blame it all on the politician. The American people are used to having things given to them. And I've said this to other people. I can talk to any group anywhere, and I can get them concerned about the deficit. And then they'll say, well, we got to take care of this. We don't want to see interest rates fly. We don't want to see inflation. We've got to, how do we do that? And I will talk to the group. And let's say it's an investment club of people over 65. And I will say, well, one thing you have to do, because Social Security is a major issue, it's indexed, is you got to raise the retirement age to 72. And the pushback from that group will be enormous. Well, oh my gosh, what we're going to do?
Right. Yes, we need to control spending, just not the spending that comes my way. Yeah.
And I can do it in agriculture. I can do it in housing. I can do it in energy. I can do it in green energy. I can do it in any of those. Yes, we have to control the deficit. Yes, we can't go on, but not for me. So what I think has to happen, and I think the Fed could be a part of this carefully. I think our politicians, if they were true leaders, they would begin to educate the public. There are no free lunches. We are going to have to pay for this one way or the other, and we need to bring our spending and our revenue balance back into better balance. Now, it doesn't mean you have to have a balanced budget next year, but you have to slow your spending and or increase your taxes to where the deficit, grows at a slower rate than your productivity of your economy.
Right.
So that you grow your way out of it without creating chaos. But if you don't do that, then you're buying a future of strong inflation, very disruptive markets, and a destroying of the productive capacity of your economy that builds wealth. And that has to be understood so that then the politicians, if they have any good judgment, can say, we will look at all of this, where everything is on the table. It's going to be shared sacrifice. We know we have to do this, but we will do it in a systematic way that favors none over others. So you got to put the lobbyists aside, you got to push them away and build a case for a systematic addressing of this very enormous problem that we are facing sooner and sooner than we might want to believe.
Okay, and I know a huge part of the problem that you're concerned about is the debt, and the implications of the debt as it continues to grow. I got to tell you, Dr. Hoenig, listen to you put that out there. I'm 100% in agreement with you of what needs to happen. I'm not terribly optimistic it's going to happen because of human nature, and I agree with you, which is, there's the old saying, we kind of get the politicians we deserve, right? Unless we're electing people in who are going to exercise that discipline and that responsibility, we're going to continue to have the type of abuses I think we've had of the system right now. And part of this is sort of a vicious cycle where our education system, talked about this a lot in this channel, really does do a very poor job. I would give it a failing grade in teaching financial literacy to the average person. So we as a mass public, we don't really even necessarily have the awareness and the know-how of the problems to demand the right type of people to come in and fulfill them. And as a result, we have dangerous precedents that get set, like I think happened during COVID. And I think we talked about this, but if I'm misremembering, please correct me. I believe you feel that the genie is a little bit out of the bottle now, where we ended up sending direct stimulus to households, because now the next time that there is any sort of national pain, the first thing the populace is going to ask for is, well, please start sending me direct checks, right? I need them. You did it last time, do it again this time, right? And we'll vote for people that are saying, yeah, put me in office, I'll give you the checks, right? Even though that is exactly what we don't need, right? That's just exacerbating the core problem. But understandable. People are thinking, largely with their limbic systems, especially when they're in pain. And so, sadly, I think to your point, the populace is probably going to be demanding the exact wrong type of political profile for our leaders for the long-term problems we face.
That problem started before COVID. It started in the financial crisis because there hundreds of billions of dollars were given to special interests, the banking industry, for example, which makes the populace upset, understandably. Now, the thing about the COVID was, I understand the need to, people put out of work, you have a safety net, you should be able and willing to take on debt to help those who are suffering from that crisis, that is, the unemployed. What happened around COVID, though, was a step too far, and that is you were giving substantial checks to people who were fully employed and making substantial income on an annual basis. Checks were being written to people making over $100,000. That's the insanity of that program. And yes, you have set that precedent as we go forward from here. But perhaps we can learn from that and not repeat the excess and only confine it to those who are needy, where you don't increase your debt by $6 trillion in a very short period of time, and you don't increase spending by 50% in 1 year. So those are things you can learn and maybe not repeat without having a crisis. The one thing I want to emphasize is that if we continue on the road we have, we don't necessarily run into a major crisis. We don't necessarily fall off the cliff. We die, as I've said before, a death of 1,000 cuts. Because when you think about it, if we continue down this road, even the Congressional Budget Office, a bipartisan analytical group within the Congress, says our productivity of our nation will fall from about 2.2% to 1.8%. Now, that's a very favorable projection, I might add. The difference in that growth rate in terms of lost real wealth and productivity achievements is over $1 trillion. That's the price we will pay. We will have a poorer nation as a result of this. Not necessary, but what we could end up doing if we don't address the problem in a systematic fashion. And that's the other part of this message that has to be carried to the public so that they are more informed and can deal with their congressmen, and their congressmen can take strong stands without being voted out of office.
Okay, and let me just make sure I understand. So, is this actually more like a double punch where productivity goes down, so we produce less, right? The pie itself doesn't grow as much, or at some point maybe start shrinking. But then also the currency units that make up the pie are worth less as well the more we go down this road.
No question about it, because when you go down that road, you think about it, you're going to have based on those projections, you'll have a debt level, which is now 35 trillion, that will be $60 trillion. And that assumes that the Fed will monetize that debt, and therefore you have more dollars outstanding. So the purchasing power of that dollar, as reflected in inflation, both asset inflation, which is still very high, and price inflation of goods and services. So your dollar buys less, yes, your real purchasing power is being harmed. And that is a consequence of printing too much money, more than the economy can absorb with the productivity levels that it's able to produce.
Okay. All right. I want to flag this as, one of the greatest challenges facing America as a nation, but as the people watching this video, this is sort of one of the big things that you have got to be really focused on going forward with your wealth, which is, okay, how do I make myself as least vulnerable as possible to this trend, right? And I'll make a quick note. I'm going to talk about this a little at the end of this video, Dr. Hoenig, but you have very kindly agreed to be one of the faculty on the upcoming fall conference for thoughtful money, the fall online conference. We're going to have Danielle DiMartino Booth interview you, so that's going to be a fantastic discussion. But part of that discussion, we will ask you some of your thoughts on what not just we as a nation, but what individuals can do to make themselves less vulnerable on this point. I'm not going to dig into it here because we're going to dig into it in the conference.
Sure.
One of the other things I want to dig into more with the conference, but let's sort of set the table here, is something I also believe is near and dear to your heart, which is we can judge whether the policy moves at the time were appropriate, whether they were good or whether they were bad. But if you look at policy decisions over, say, the past 20 years, both monetary policy and fiscal policy, I think it's pretty hard to disagree that the outcome of the policies benefited those who already had assets much more so than people who didn't. And so we've been experiencing an accelerating wealth divide in this country. And you're nodding as I'm saying this, but feel free to contradict anything I'm saying when I give you the baton. Do you see that trajectory as set to continue unless we have some big change of behavior going forward? In other words, is this a real and present danger that you still worry about?
It most certainly is. I think that I'm disappointed that we did not anticipate over the last 2 decades the possible effects of the policy. Now, the rationale for the policy in the Federal Reserve, and I think even within Congress, but let's just talk about the Federal Reserve for a moment. In 2010, in 2010, the economy was recovering. Unemployment was still nearly 10%. And the thought was, well, we can print this money, we can push interest rates down to zero, near zero, and therefore that will accelerate employment. Without fully, I think, exploring what it means to asset values and the divide of wealth. And I don't think it was intentionally ignored. I think it was just being too focused on a short-run goal rather than looking to the long run. And I've often said the central bank's job, more than any other, that's why it's given its independence, is to take care of the long run so that short run can take care of itself. But we decided, the Federal Reserve decided, which I was a part of, to look at the short run and focus on that. And thinking, now we print this money. Now, what happened was...
But before you go, I just want to make sure people realize you were part of the Federal Reserve at that point in time. You were a voting member on the FOMC. You also were the lone dissenter against QE and set the record at the Fed for dissenting votes. So I do want to give you the credit to the viewing audience here that might not be aware that you were concerned that QE might have some of the implications that it did.
I strongly objected to the program. And the reason is that, let me start with the simplest way of saying it. I've told people over and over again, give me a commodity or give me a service that trades well or efficiently at a zero price. Give me one. So interest rates are the price of time or the price of money in today's context. And here they were pricing it at zero, near zero, 25 basis points or lower. So why did you expect that would be beneficial? And the reason, well, this would force portfolio adjustments and force people to take greater risk and therefore invest. Well, they took on less risk with more leverage because the government, or the Federal Reserve in this case, promised them that interest rates would not be a problem going forward. So it invited speculation, it invited a misallocation of resources, and in keeping rates that low, it increased arbitrarily asset values, and that is wealth, monetary wealth, for those people who had assets, and it disadvantaged people who did not have assets already. New entrants into the labor market, the lower middle income and lower income sector of the economy. they were disadvantaged. Now, the idea was it would improve employment, but the fact of the matter is, through that decade, as I feared, I think is a fair way of saying it, productivity in the economy was not particularly strong. It was less than it was in the decade of the 90s. Real wage increases was not particularly strong. It was less than it was in the 90s. Mm-hmm. So that both in terms of the asset values and in terms of income generation, the wealth was distributed more widely. Now, towards the end of the decade, just prior to COVID and then following COVID, the lower end began to see bigger increases in wages. But in the context of where the price level had moved to and where the asset value was nothing.
Yeah.
So who today in the lower middle income can afford a new house? Even if interest rates were lower, house prices have again doubled in the last 5 to 6 years. So doing QE, it seems nice. It's well intended. I'm not questioning the intention, but it is not the way an economy runs best. It is not the way people have income distributed based on their effort, their education, and their willingness to work.
So what I'm wrestling with that is, I like you, I think relatively intelligent people, I'm sure, could have debated, but I think a lot of relatively intelligent people would have raised a lot of the risks about what happened. And so, I think it worries a lot of listeners who were like, yeah, I'm actually almost more worried about the well-intentioned government policy because, it's sort of like, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you. Sometimes those are the most destructive words ever, right? Gosh, one of the things you said that just, I got to comment on, which is, it seemed like it was the intent and they thought it was a good thing. Hey, let's force people to invest out the risk curve, right? Which, when you have a growing population of seniors, which we had, right? We had the baby boomers starting to hit retirement age, and they were planning on living on a fixed income, and suddenly they couldn't, right? Because treasuries were yielding less than 1%, right? You had all these people that were going out on the risk curve to get yield or return, where they really had no business being that far out in the risk curve, given their personal situation. Now, they fortunately, there weren't too many big drawdowns between 2010 and 2021, but there sure could have been. And those people pretty much slammed into 2022, and got totally caught by surprise and saw their portfolios down by 20% or more, right? So I find it like really hard to be able to justify this. Let's push everybody out the risk curve when the damage it can do to the people that have no business being out there.
Well, you have to remember, number one, you're correct. It is a very, I think, predictable adverse consequences. And I would tell you that when this was going on, I was in touch with bankers all the time. And the interesting part, I talked to the banker who's trust operations. And he said, there were people who had put their money into trust for retirement. They were that were unable to live even close to what they had thought they were going to be able to live at because they couldn't get a return. When you have low interest rates and lots of leverage, that is a subsidy to the debtor. It is a subsidy that is passed from the creditor, from the saver, to the debtor.
Yep.
And this is what you facilitated during that process. Now, I think people should have, reasonable leverage to invest are good things because it increases productivity. But the reward then for the saver who's providing that funds should not be forgotten. And when we force down through our policy interest rates that favors one over the other, you're making choices for other people. And I think that's unfortunate. It's not the market. It's not an economic system working anymore. And people blame it on capitalism. It wasn't capitalism. It was a very different form of socialism that we were practicing at the time.
All right. I think it's very meaningful that you, a former voting member of the FOMC, are using those particular words. And I know you don't use them lightly. Okay, so let me ask you this. So a lot of the people that I interview, when I ask them to look out into the future, this is what I would say the majority think. Not saying they're right, but if I had to kind of distill it down into one consensus, it's the economy is going to continue to slow. At some point, the lag effects are going to catch up with us. The economy is going to start falling into recession, which I just got to editorialize here for a moment, shouldn't be seen as a nuclear event. Recessions are just part of the business cycle, but for some reason now we treat them like they're, Armageddon. And that if that does happen, that we enter recession, that the policy response, both monetary and fiscal, is going to be dramatic and going to try to use the same playbook that we have used in 2028 and now COVID. If that arc were to happen, do you expect the same? Do you expect something similar, or do you think we've either learned our lessons or we've evolved in our thinking policy-wise that you would expect something different?
Well, that is a certainly plausible scenario that people have described. Now, no one knows for sure. The first thing is I back up. Perhaps we will fall into a recession. I don't know that at the moment, but I would also remind people that there's still a lot of fiscal spending going on that is in place for green energy, for manufacturing. The safety net is indexed. So there's a lot of reasons to believe that while we may end up in a recession, I actually thought we would have, because I expected the interest rates to rise further, and they have not, and that's fine. But so the recession may be a ways off. Eventually, the odds are we will one day enter a recession. To answer then the second part of your question, will we respond in the same way? The tendency will be to respond in the same way. I think you will have a big increase in spending to offset it, depending on the size of the recession, and the monetary policy will be eased. I hope not too much, but it will be eased. And the question is, will they avoid the mistake of easing too much? It's not that they ease, it's will they avoid the mistake of easing too much, which has been the perennial question since the late 90s at least, or early 2000. So I think that's a real risk, that they will ease too much. Now, here's what I would say to you. I can understand going forward if the Federal Reserve is very careful in its wording to say we are, given the outlook that we see of continued growth of better than 2% or in that range, that inflation would come down, but we will lower rates only as much as inflation comes down, so that the real interest rate, which is the nominal rate right now, which is 5.3 minus inflation, I'll use the CPI 3, okay, it's 2.3%. As that comes down to 2%, we will lower rates. Okay? If that difference comes down to 2%, we will lower rates till 2%. Then we will have inflation of 2% and growth of over 2% and a stable 2% growth rate. If we have that, that means the nominal interest rate, I know this sounds complicated,
That's okay. People get it.
The nominal interest rate will be 4%. That would be the nominal federal funds rate that they set. That's the equilibrium. That's what we will hold to. If we have a recession, we may go somewhat below that, maybe 100 basis points at most. We will not go back to 25 basis points. And we will let the economy recover at its own pace. And as it does, we will bring the interest rates back up to so-called equilibrium 4% nominal rate. Now, if productivity increases, and we have a greater growth rate, well, then perhaps our interest rate will be adjusted, our so-called equilibrium rate. But right now we're saying 2% productivity is about right, 2% inflation is a target, 4% nominal GDP is the Fed funds rate we would like to see maintained. That's a clear message. It tells the world, don't look for 25 basis points again. It tells the market, don't speculate on the assumption that we're going to lower to 25 basis points. This is it. And we're not budging. Now it's a big responsibility for the Fed to take on. That is their job.
Well, as I said this on your previous appearances, if we only had central bankers that had your courage and push for both responsibility and clarity, I don't know. I will light a candle at the shrine of central banking that happens. Like I said, I'm finding it hard to be real optimistic on that, but we'll see. And obviously, the more that you can get your voice out there in the world, hopefully it may have an impact in shaping some of this destiny. All right. Well, look, as we start to wrap up here, just one last thing on wealth equality, and then we'll wrap it up. You were talking about, like, even if interest rates come down at this point, assets like housing are at current prices just unaffordable for a record percentage of the populace, right? And I mean, in theory, if interest rates come down, mortgage rates comes down, prices should go even higher here, although separate discussion. I think that might not happen this time, but we'll see. But that's largely based on the fact that when mortgage rates went up, prices were supposed to come down and they didn't, right? So that's kind of broken at this time. And well, I'd love to get your thoughts on that specifically. I think the bigger question is just, I have kids that are college age, either in college or now recently out of college. I spent a lot of time anecdotally talking to my sort of, sphere, but also spent a lot of time both reading, data and surveys online, as well as I have a pretty big social media following and follow a lot of other folks as well. The dialogue, I think, nationally, as best I can see it, is anybody who has a Gen Z child and maybe even a younger millennial child is very concerned about them ever being able to afford a house and just sort of the elements of what used to be sort of seen as a middle-class lifestyle. And so what I've been saying a lot on this channel is that I think an increasing percentage of the populace is losing faith that the American dream is reachable for them. And by American dream, I think relatively modest asks, like, I want to be able to afford a home, I want to be able to put my kids through school, and I hope to be able to retire at some point in my life, right? And I think along with that is a sense that a bit of betrayal, right? That, like, hey, the social contract doesn't work for us anymore. We're kind of getting the short end of the stick, and those boomers have all the assets here, and we're kind of screwed. I don't think anything good comes of that when a growing percentage of your society loses faith in the social contract, to the point where some people are already saying. I had a guest on this channel who's a real estate expert, a very respected one, who said maybe we're already at the point of renter nation. Like maybe just the affluent own all the houses from here and everybody else just rents forever from them. I want to get your concluding thoughts on this, because this is another topic I want to dig into more deeply in the conference. And the conference will sort of say, hey, Dr. Hoenig, what are some of the reforms you would like to see most to try to bring this under control? But we'll get into those reforms in the conference. But right now, like, how concerned are you about this element that I've talked about, where it seems like, certainly part of millennials and most of Gen Z are really kind of losing faith in the future?
Well, I think they should not lose faith. They can't just be concerned, though. They need to educate themselves to the topics that we're talking about today. For example, what are the trade-offs? I think that's the critical link. I think the United States still has the best economy in the world. It has the greatest potential. If it doesn't squander it as it is risking, I realize. So I think it can be addressed, but the key is to stop focusing on just the amount of money, but how much productivity do we have in our economy, and what are the necessary ingredients to productivity? And those are, yes, a rule of law, a respect for contracts, and that means not over-regulating. It means relying on the rule of law and contract. That's number one. Number two is we have to educate. I think we're educating to a fairly low common denominator rather than a high common denominator. That's a big
totally
issue.
agree.
That's a big issue because an educated populace will be more informed on the politics, more informed on the innovation. That's America's strength. So we have to build on that. That's just another thing. Third is we have to know what it means to have discipline. I tell people, do you know of any really world-class athlete that doesn't have self-discipline and practice every day and control their impulses? That's another element we have to have. And that is, yes, we have to have adults leading us in our fiscal policy. We have to have Congress people who understand basic economics and know that you cannot spend and borrow without having very dire consequences, making the rich richer, as a matter of fact, instead of making all richer. So that's what we need that. The second is we need a central bank who knows its mission. And that is its mission is the long term. Yes, it has to manage in the short term, but always with an eye to the long term and what the consequences of its actions will be, and then exercise its independence to make sure that fiscal policy is also administered well. So you need those ingredients. We have the potential. So I haven't given up on it. I'm concerned about it. That's why I speak out on it. But I think if we better inform ourselves and better discipline ourselves, we will remain the greatest country in the world. If we don't, well, not in my generation, not in your generation, probably not in your kids' generation, but down the road, we will become a also ran in the world of economics and growth and real wealth.
All right. Well, a huge part of the mission behind this channel, and I know with your outreach, is to help with that education, and obviously with the intent of trying to avoid that potential darker future down the road. So again, I want to thank you again for all your efforts there. All right. Well, look, always just an incredible privilege and incredibly illuminating talking with you, Dr. Hoenig. For folks that have enjoyed this conversation and would like to follow you and your work in between now and when you come on for the conference, where should they go?
Well, they have two sources. One is Mercatus Center. It's Discourse Magazine. And the second is a blog called FinRegRag at Mercatus, where I and others of my colleagues put out our thought pieces, some of our study summaries and so forth. And I think it's a very useful blog for people to look at from time to time.
All right. Well, Dr. Hoenig, when I edit this, I will put up the links to both of those on the screen so folks know exactly where to go. Folks will also have links in the description below the video too, so you can get to those with one click. And again, at the conference, Dr. Hoenig, one of the other things that we'll want to dig into with you is, having you look out on what you think monetary and fiscal policy is going to be over the next, say, 12, 18 months or so, and what impact you think that might have on the financial markets given their current condition, because of course the conference is really all about investors trying to navigate the road ahead. All right, well, folks, if you've really enjoyed having Dr. Hoenig on the channel, sharing his expertise with us, please let him know that by hitting the like button, then clicking on the red subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. Obviously, I'll make my little pitch I make every video that if you are trying to navigate this environment, especially through the currents that Dr. Hoenig has talked about here with us today, highly recommend that most people, unless you have a really strong record as a do-it-yourself investor, do so under the guidance of a good professional financial advisor, but one that takes into account the issues that Dr. Hoenig and I have talked about here today. If you've got a good one who's doing that for you, great, stick with them. But if not, or if you'd like a second opinion from one who does, consider scheduling a free consultation with one of the advisors that Thoughtful Money endorses. To do that, just go fill out the short form at thoughtfulmoney.com. And obviously, while you're there, go to thoughtfulmoney.com/conference and sign up for the conference if you haven't already. We're still offering the early bird discount price, which is the lowest price that will be offered for the conference. And if you're a premium subscriber to our Substack, you get an additional $50 off of the ticket price. And a quick reminder, only cost you $15 a month to be a Substack subscriber. So if you want to just sign up for 1 month, pay $15, save 50, pocket 35, I would be happy if you did that. All right. Well, look, cannot thank you enough, Dr. Hoenig. Again, thank you so much for all your efforts to try to, educate folks, but also try to educate and shape thinking at the policy level, and hopefully maybe, move us towards better decisions in the future so that we can have better outcomes. The potential is there. We just have to choose to be able to do that, both as individuals, but certainly as a nation.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been good to be with you again. And I hope it does help our public to better understand some of the issues and not be confused.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Hoenig. Everybody else, thanks so much for watching.